So today we're going to finish up talking about monopolies and antitrust policy. Again, starting with monopoly regulation, then moving into deregulation. So if we remember from a couple weeks ago, we talked about natural monopolies, and this is just when, in general, a monopoly naturally arises from a certain market. So we often see happens is that the average cost declines as more and more people get into this market or into this one firm. And typically we see this when we have these high fixed costs and relatively small variable costs. So if we think about something like our electricity, it's fairly expensive to build a infrastructure of power lines and all that stuff. So it's expensive to get in to build a power grid. However, to hook an individual house up to that power grid is a relatively low cost. Once the house is built and everything, you basically just hook it up and then basically meaning I am simplifying it. Basically, you hook it up and then it works. So we have these natural monopolies that come up, and again, they're kind of just naturally there. So what we want to do is we want to find a way to make it where these natural monopolies can exist, but they are not going to take advantage of or overly take advantage of the consumers. So to do this, what we're going to look at is two types of regulations that we'll be interested in, and look at the advantage, disadvantage of each, figure out what happens if we put them together, and then deregulation. So the two types that we're going to introduce are called cost plus and price cap. So cost plus, basically what we do is we tell the firms that you are allowed to make a certain level of profit. That is, you can charge a price that covers your costs and then some, what we may consider a normal level of profit. And that's where, again, something that we think is fair. You're not necessarily taking advantage of people, but we don't mind people making profit because that gives you an incentive to provide a service. So if we look at the cost plus, right, we're going to have we have our cost plus, and we're going to look at the advantages of this and the disadvantages. And when I think about the advantages of cost plus, I'm going to see there are going to be two main things that I'm going to focus on. The first is going to be for the consumer, and that is the consumer is allowed a profit. And we may even see and is guaranteed a profit. Right? And this will be a reasonable profit, but again, they're guaranteed that profit, so they're not going to, the cost plus regulation is not going to make it where a firm has to operate at a loss, right? Which again, we don't mind that because it makes it where they want to actually provide the good. The second advantage, though, is that the profit is limited and hopefully kept kept reasonable. So the first advantage is for the producer, and the second is for the consumer. However, the disadvantage kind of couples up with this first advantage. That is, and this up here, sorry, I should have said the producer is allowed or guaranteed a profit. But the disadvantage that we'll see with this kind of stems with that first advantage, and that is that the producer has no incentive to keep their cost reasonable. And as I'm using this example, I'm not saying that any profession, I'm not saying that, hey, any profession doesn't work hard. I'm just saying compared to what their market rate would be. So if we think a producer has no incentive to keep their costs reasonable, in the cost plus, and in a pure cost plus case, a producer could come in and pay everybody on their staff $1 million a year. That's salary of $1 million. So everybody from the CEO to sales reps, right? We might say, yeah, they can pay them all $1 million a year. Now, in this case, uh, and if you were going to work for them, sure, that'd make you happy. But in this case, they'd have to pay for those workers. So that pay is going to come from the cost of providing electricity. So if they don't have that, so what this does basically is they can go through, pay all their workers this exorbitant wage, and then ultimately the consumer has to pay for it. So they have no incentive to keep costs reasonable, which hurts the consumer because that could raise the price of electricity up to some unreasonable rate. And again, that's cost plus by itself. So that's the main advantages, disadvantages I see with cost plus. The second type we have is called price cap regulation. And what this does is says that there's a price, or we set a maximum price that a firm cannot exceed for some period of time. So if we look at price cap, we'll again look at advantages and disadvantages. So our advantages with price cap is that the first is for the consumer, that prices themselves stay reasonable. So that is the consumer, and I guess the second part that piggybacks off of that number one is that firms must be wary of their costs to produce the good. So the electric company now isn't just going to go in and pay their workers like 10 times the market wage for a given job just because they can, right? In this case, now they have to be aware of their costs because the if they if their costs go up too high, say above this price cap, then they're going to not be able to run a profit because again, they have this price cap that's in place. So they have to be aware of their costs and the prices stay reasonable. But the disadvantage to the price cap, and again, this could be how you look at it, but the disadvantage that could come up is it's unflexible if energy costs change. Or in times of shock. So if the cost of energy, say, doubles overnight, potentially the price that's outside of the company's control could go up and they need to charge a higher rate to be able to pay their bills, but because of this price cap, they're not able to. So we don't have that flexibility that we have with the cost plus, but we have a little bit more oversight, a little bit more, hey, you have to stay in check, and so on. So we have these two separate, but if we put them together, then something more interesting can happen. So if they are together, then our profits are reasonable, and costs cannot, or excuse me. So the profits remain reasonable, but the price is also reasonable. That is not too high. And when we put them together, what the firm has an incentive to do is not necessarily to go right up to that price cap because things can happen. There could be that shock in electric prices. There could be whatever happens. But what they can do, so what they might do is say, hey, we need to set our costs up so that we're a little ways below that price cap. That way we're not, that way we're not one little bit away from going broke. But again, they still get to keep their profits. So just because they need to make a moderate price increase, they don't necessarily have to go in and go through the whole process of a price increase just to make that happen. But what we may be interested in is an outside of just these moderate little price increases that we're talking about. Uh, how can a company or can a utility, electric company, raise rates? And by saying raise rates, we're going to say above the price cap. And this process, and it's probably going to be oversimplified by me, but I'm fine with that. So we have a few steps in this process of how an electric company is actually going to be able to raise rates. And around at least in Iowa, a lot of your smaller, medium-sized towns, I kind of faced this issue fairly recently with Alliant. So the first thing that the company has to do is request the price increase with the state utility board. State utility board. So fairly recently, Alliance said, "Hey, we want to increase our energy rates." So they're gonna first have to come in, tell the state utility board, "Hey, we need to raise our rates because of whatever the reason is. Maybe it's because the price of coal or natural gas has increased. Maybe they want to invest in solar or wind energy, right? Whatever the case is, they're going to request that price increase." And again, this is oversimplified, but for right now, I think that's okay. So then after they request this price increase, the firm or I'm going to say the utility will hold town halls in the affected communities. And we saw this. So in the case of Alliant and Boone and throughout the state of Iowa, Alliant posted little things. They said, "Hey, we are proposing a rate increase. We'll have a town hall or some similar type of event, spread throughout the state to kind of talk about what they did." And the reason for this, there are kind of two reasons for this. The first is that it gives the utility a chance to explain themselves. So it gives the utility a chance to say, "Hey, this is why we need to increase prices." And again, this could be for whatever reason that is going on is what it could be. It could be because energy increase. It could be because there's some new law in place. It could be that they want to switch over to a new type of energy, right? Whether it's from coal to natural gas, or maybe they're looking into solar or nuclear or some other sort of energy maybe they're looking into, and it requires uh, some short-term price increases, or probably long-term, but for now we'll say short-term price increases to make that work. So first, it gives them a chance to explain themselves. Then it gives the community a chance, or members of the community, a chance to have their voices heard. Right. So in the community, we can come in and we can say, "Well, do we not support this? Are there reasons that we should support this price hike, or are there reasons that we shouldn't?" Whatever the case may be. Now, if I understood it right, the case with Alliant, which kind of was going on right when we moved in, so uh, we kind of jumped into the middle of it, I guess. But in the case of Alliant, um, if I understood right, it was because they wanted to invest in wind energy or some sort of renewable energy. And what they said was something along the lines of, "We need to have a 25% energy increase so that we can pay for this new investment." And what the community was saying was kind of along the lines of, we don't mind renewable and we don't mind the solar, excuse me, we don't mind wind power, but we don't want to pay that much of a premium for it, right? So what the community might have been saying in this case is, maybe we can wait to get wind power until it becomes a little more affordable or a little lower in cost. So they have that chance to have their voices heard. Then there may have been some people who came up and said, you know what, yeah, but we want to, we want to invest in wind because, uh, because it's green and it's renewable and all that good stuff. So in our town halls, we have this opportunity to have this discussion and, really figure out, is it worth the rate increase, is it not, and understand how the communities feel about it. Then after these town halls, um, we will return to our utility board for a vote. And if it passes, they get the price increase. If it doesn't, they don't. But the thing that the utility board has to be aware of is, utility board consists of legislators, and these legislators have to be, they are up for re-election every X number of years. So if Alliant came in and said, and I'm going to go a little more drastic than our case, but if they said, hey, we want to increase energy rates by 200%, if they said we're going to double the energy rates, and it got approved, then the people down in Des Moines or in the state capital, for here it's Des Moines, but wherever it is, people down in the state capital then have to come back home come election season and have to justify why they allowed an energy company to double the rates, or in our case, to raise our rates by 25% or whatever the case may be. So they have that situation going with the utility board. If the legislators went strongly against the community, they could potentially lose their seat. But on the other side, if the community was saying, you know what, we don't mind an investment in green, we don't mind an investment in wind power, so we're fine to pay that increase. Um, if the utility board then declines something that the community was fine with, they again would have to come back and answer to the community. So they have that, and it kind of keeps things, at least in theory, that's going to keep things in check and keep it where everyone is hopefully honest and so on. In a couple seconds, we'll see a counter argument to that, but we'll see that in a moment. So that's our regulations. We have our two types: cost plus, price cap, and then we see how our regulations can change as we go through time. So one of the issues that can come up with regulation is, well, there are issues that can come up. So we're going to get into is what's called deregulation. So there may come a time in our market, or as we go through time, that we want to deregulate an industry. That is, we're going to remove these government controls over prices and quantities. And one of the reasons we may be interested in this, and maybe it depends on the firm, but we'll have what's called this regulatory capture. And this is the problem that come up with this whole idea that we were just saying. So the idea is that if I'm a regulated firm, I have to do what regulators say, and I have to do what the law says, and so on. But we could be in a situation where I, as a firm, actually play a pretty good role in what regulations we have to follow. So we have this regulatory capture. What we're saying is that our firms have this large role in setting in the regulations, and they follow. So they kind of capture the regulation themselves. In a way, we may think of this as a prisoner is running the prison. There are a couple ways you can think of this. A couple sayings that go with this. But in short, basically what can happen, so if I scroll back over to our how we can change things, So we have this whole process where we have town halls and so on. But from here, we have these legislators that have to get reelected. Now, what the utility company could do, and I'm sure there's probably something about this that's illegal, but we're not we're not introducing those kind of laws really. But at this point, with what we have so far, what the utility board could say is that okay, you're gonna give us this price increase, and if you don't get reelected, our legislators can also get hired on by the utility company if they are not reelected. So in this case, what the utility company could come in and say is again, hey, just give us the price increase. We'll give you a job, and all this would be under the table, of course. But we'll give you a job, and if you give us a price increase, we'll give you a job. So this makes it where the politician or the legislator really has nothing to lose by voting yes. And granted, they're not going to do this for everybody, but if they have one person who is a potentially the swing candidate who gets to control who kind of is that swing vote, they can potentially make things work that way. So the big example of deregulation that I want to get into is the airline industry. Personally, I'm interested in airlines and flying, but it's a really good example of deregulation and some of the benefits that we can see from it. So the big year, so we have all these dates and stuff. The big one that I'm going to focus on right now is 1978 when we passed the Airline Deregulation Act. And what I'm going to do is look at um, look at two different situations. Excuse me, or look at two areas where we were with airline regulations. And I'll respond to that chat in just a moment. So we have pre 1978, then we'll have post 1978. And before 1978, we had that our airlines were regulated. And then post 1978, we did deregulation. So before 1978, we had that our airlines were considered regulated. So what this means is, isn't referring to them having to tell you how to put on a seatbelt or them having a maintenance record or having a maintenance standard. Instead, what we're referring more to is the routes themselves being regulated and what routes you can fly and so on. So in this case, kind of three things are really what came up. The first is the government decided who could fly what routes. So they might say that the route from Des Moines to Chicago is owned by United Airlines. The second thing that we see is that the government chooses the number of flights and the number of seats per day. So, if say United Airlines has that flight from Des Moines to Chicago, if there's something that goes on, like I don't know, some virus that goes through the country and causes a global pandemic, if something like that goes on, maybe United doesn't have the flexibility to scale back their flights a little bit while nobody's traveling, right? So they have to do their same number of flights, same number of seats every day, or if the area grows, um, it may take a decent amount of time to recover or to adjust for that growth and so on. So government chooses number of flights and number of seats in those flights. And the third little bit that we have is that government sets the prices. And what this led to was, what this actually led to before 1978 was little competition And actually, as surprising as this actually led to higher prices and empty flights. And the reason those empty flights were is because if I can't adjust my schedule based off of demand, um, I have potentially some inefficiencies. So maybe the flights from Des Moines to Chicago were empty, but the flights from Chicago to New York were overly full and nobody could buy a ticket. Right? That's just as an example. But we have that situation where it's hard to make adjustments because it's a process. Um, and whereas today, and we'll get to today in a second, but personally, if I book a flight in advance enough, especially if it's from our smaller towns, uh, and Des Moines, I'm saying smaller with respect to Chicago, Houston, LA, New York, and all that. But if you're going to a smaller city and you potentially booked out pretty far in advance, there's a decent chance that you get a schedule change uh, between the time you booked and the time that the flight actually goes. So uh, we have that situation come up, and that's something that we can see. So what we're interested in next is what happens in post 1978. So this is after the Deregulation Act. And basically, what we see happen is firms now can decide whether they want to. Firms have the choice to decide how to go about their. Excuse me, let me rephrase this one more time. Airlines now have a choice what routes to fly, who to fly, and so on. So what we saw with this post regulation was one, we actually saw new airlines come up. So new airlines are now able to enter the market, right? The second thing is we had more flexibility with schedules and number of seats. So if when the time regulation started, United was told, well, you have to take a big plane from Des Moines to Chicago, um, and I'm just using big and small planes just to keep it simple, not expecting people to understand every little bit of um, not having to understand every single bit of airplane jargon out there. But if United started in Des Moines with a large plane and Des Moines actually shrunk, or maybe something happened to Des Moines where they just don't have the demand that they used to, then they wouldn't. Then originally they would not have had that flexibility, but today they would have the flexibility to go ahead and make a smaller plane fly that route, or maybe cut out one of the flights every day, or whatever the case is. So you have new airlines enter the market, more flexibility with schedules for the airlines, and three, what we ended up seeing was lower prices, and that's as a result of this. Oops, I want that in blue. So as a result of our more competition, and since we don't have to run these empty flights, uh, you're able to run a lower cost option, which works pretty well for us. And then what this led to, again, um, was more choice in air travel. It led to a more efficient process. And that is, inefficient for us might not be the most desirable thing, but as far as our wallets are concerned, it probably is. So when I'm thinking about efficiency, what I'm thinking about is, again, for the most part, if you fly today, you're hardly ever on an empty plane. And again, today meaning ignore the work around the whole coronavirus where, everything's kind of a little crazier than normal. But if it were a normal day if today were a normal day, we wouldn't be flying around a bunch of empty planes. Right? For the most part, they'd be fairly full. Uh, As it's been a while since I've been on a flight that's not a midnight flight to Des Moines from St. Louis. That's not, for the most part, fairly full. So we have this more efficient travel, more choice in our travel. Um, and then the last one we had was, again, we generally have lower prices than we used to. And these lower prices would be in real terms. So maybe the nominal price of an airline ticket has gone up throughout the years. But what we excuse me. So the nominal price, sure, probably has gone up throughout the years. But if we look at how long do I have to work to buy an airline ticket, or how accessible is airline travel to the entire population, as we go through the years, it's more reasonable for someone even in it's more reasonable for everybody to travel than just the rich, right? And as we go through time, more and more and more, with more recent innovations, it's actually not like, and not saying that it's cheap to travel overseas, but it's reasonable for an average person to be able to go overseas, uh, and not have to save up for a whole year just to make that happen. And that's thanks to improvements in aircraft. So one of the newer planes cuts the cost of flying by a ton just in terms of fuel saving, but also, with new competition, you have low cost overseas carriers. One of them is Norwegian Airlines. And what they do, again, that you can get overseas for a fairly low rate, which is pretty cool. So we have these three effects that came up, but we have one drawback to our deregulation, and that is, what about our small airports? What about small towns, small or remote towns, cities, or I should say cities, not towns, but our small, remote cities and airports? So with regulation, these people in these smaller airports or these smaller cities, they had, so whereas for your more popular routes, they were kind of like, well, we'd like to have competition, and we'd like to have some lower rates. But in these smaller cities or these more remote places, they didn't really have the same thing go on. Instead, what they said was, well, we have a reasonably priced flight, but now it's going to become more expensive because either I it's going to go one of two ways. One, it'll either become more expensive, or our service will be eliminated because these cities are not necessarily profitable for a private airline. Or for they're all private, but it's not necessarily profitable to serve these less populated areas. And mobility, like transportation services, actually lead to a higher GDP for an area as well, right? That is, if say we had a regular sized city, something like Des Moines, and there was no airport in Des Moines. There was no way to travel other than to drive yourself somewhere or not. That's going to make people not want to move there, because if I have to drive, and granted, there may be times where I choose to drive 3 hours to get on a plane because there may be a cost savings. But if I have to do that, if I don't have an option of a local way to travel across the world, a lot of people are going to say, well, I don't want to live there because it's not convenient to get around or travel. Or if we think about firms, um, if Wells Fargo is doing a meeting with some company based out of, say, if Wells Fargo in Des Moines has a meeting with somebody based out of Denver, and someone from Denver is coming into Des Moines for a business trip, they don't really want to fly into Kansas City then drive 3 hours, right? If it's something for business, you just want to go where it's local, get in, get out, and you're good to go. So this transportation, again, leads to higher GDP for an area. But to counter this concern, to counter, let's write this. What we did was created what's called essential air service. And basically what this does is it's a federal subsidy for airlines to serve these small towns. Or small, I should be saying cities. Because you're small, and I mean even Boone's a city, but right, we're looking at smaller or maybe even medium-sized or more remote cities that don't have as much going on around them. So essentially the rules of our essential air service are: one, it has to be considered remote. I think that's like 2 hours away from a certain, it's like 70 miles or something like that from a certain airport. But the rules for the airline are going to be: one, you have to fly. You have to fly the routes. And then again, there's a certain number of seats that have to be offered and a number of flights. Right. So if the plane does not go, they don't get paid for they don't get their subsidy for that flight. And it is a flight by flight basis. It's not like hey, here's a bunch of money, fly this route. Instead, so if you do have to cancel for weather or whatever the case is, you don't lose your subsidy because one flight doesn't work. So you have to fly the routes, and you have to have consistent pricing. So what this means is that you can't charge more. Different prices 5 months out versus 1 day out. And that's versus 1 day out. Sorry, my pen's kind of being a little funny today. Oh, that's why. Okay, whatever. So we can't change our prices. So whereas normally, and again, ignore the fact that the virus is coming through and we have coronavirus in our area that's affecting demand. If it were a normal day and I were to book a flight for tomorrow, it'd probably be fairly expensive to do. However, if I book it for 3, 4, 5 months out in advance, I'm going to get a lot better of a deal. The essential air service operators can't do that. They have to have this consistent pricing. They can have different price tiers, so one that's not flexible, one that is flexible, but it has to be consistent throughout times. They also are allowed to do sales, but again, that's something where the base price has to be the same, I guess is what we're getting at. So we have consistent pricing and they have to fly the routes. So the last little bit for today looks at what does the service look like in Iowa? And what we have is a little airline called Air Choice One. If you ever get the chance to go. It's a pretty fun little experience. So we have Air Choice One as our essential, and what they do is they have 3 cities in Iowa, and I should say from and to. And what they can do is they can take you from 3 cities in Iowa to 3 larger airports. So they have flights out of Fort Dodge, Mason City, and Burlington. And they'll take you to either Minneapolis, Chicago, or St. Louis. So you have these choices between either of these cities to from Fort Dodge, Mason City, Burlington to either Minneapolis, Chicago, or St. Louis. And in general, their fares are either in one way $30, $60, or $90. And what it works out to is, if we think about what is the subsidy versus the fare, It works out that, when you buy a ticket, and I did this is rough math, this isn't precise, but you have a subsidy of about, I think last time I flew them, I did the math and it was about $200 per ticket. So if I pay $30, the federal government's gonna come in and give the airline an extra $200 to fly me from Fort Dodge to Chicago, St. Louis, from Minneapolis. So that's kind of what we see. And if you're interested in this, and even if it's a really cool thing that, well, if you're interested in looking into this a little more, there's a video on Blackboard, and it's titled "The Government." It's something along the lines of the government program that pays your airfare. It's titled something like that. There's a link in Blackboard, and when I upload this, I'll throw a link in the description to that video, meaning the YouTube description. But there's that for you. It's a really cool little video, and what it goes into is goes a little more in depth than what I'm going into it. But it looks at this essential air service, this program, or the subsidy, looks at how it works, what's the advantages of it, and what's the drawbacks of it, and goes a little bit more in depth than what uh, I'm going to go into for right now. But that's what I have for this chapter 11 on monopolies, or excuse me, on antitrust laws and monopoly. Uh, Again, it's fun stuff, and there's a lot of programs that we see, even when we're thinking about becoming out of monopoly. How can we protect, in the case of deregulation? Um, Basically, one of the overarching themes we see, as with anything in economics, everything has advantages, everything has its drawbacks, and what we have to do is figure out um, how can we best manage those. As always, if you need anything, feel free, let me know, and I'm going to get this recording stopped. So have fun.